Hello and welcome to the Creativity Couch. We're your hosts and creativity agony aunts, and along with special guests, we're here to answer all your creativity challenges, conflicts and conundrums as we take a deep dive into the sweet and salty realities of creativity and living a creative life. No topic is off limits, so make yourself a cuppa and come join us on the Creativity Couch. Today's episode of the Creativity Couch was filmed using the magic of the interwebs, connecting America with Australia. So the sound isn't quite to the standard you might be used to from Creativity Couch, but the content is, as always, fantastic. Enjoy.
Hello everybody, welcome to the Creativity Couch. I'm Anna from Mama Creative.
And I'm Christina from Creative Consultancies.
And this is Snowflake, who just is part of the couch.
Yeah.
So today we are going to be talking about memoir writing and staying true to your story. So the Creativity Couch, every week or every session, we talk to someone who's an expert about a story or about a creativity conflict, conundrum or problem or challenge that someone from our communities has written to us, and we're going to talk about that from more different perspectives. And today we are going to be talking specifically about memoir writing, and why we got Michele in, because she is an expert and she spent 5 years writing her amazing book, This Kind of Silence, which is an absolutely wonderful read. And just a little bit of an extra bit of information, Michele was mentored by Joanne Fedler, who is also on our podcast.
Yes.
Who is a writing giant, right?
Yes.
Tell you a little bit about, well, actually, we're going to get you to share us a little bit about your book, but is it true that this is possibly being optioned for a film or some type of screen adaptation?
Say that again, Anna. Was it true that what?
That this might be optioned for a film or some type of screen down the track?
Yes.
Wow. Is that top secret? Are we allowed to talk about that?
No, it's so Joanne Fedler published it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's still being sought out maybe for a US publisher too.
That's amazing.
Oh wow.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's really exciting. It's kind of in the middle of that right now.
Wow. So everybody, if you write a really amazing memoir, you might be able to get that to the next level, which might be an adaptation and published around the world. But to get there, you need to write a really good book. Now, this is about how losing my hearing taught me to listen. And so when Michele was 32 years old, she was a school teacher. She was married, mother of 2. And one day she woke up and she couldn't hear.
Which I'm a musician, so there's like my whole chest goes tight at the thought of that, and my stomach is just doing a big dip. So like the fact that you've gone through that, like even right there, I'm like, okay, wow.
And Michele lost her hearing for 4 years, and it mysteriously returned as mysteriously as it had left. And so this memoir is about her search for not allowing that to be the answer, that she was going to be deaf for the rest of her life. And so it's her story. But in this story, in your memoir, you also, where you opened yourself up to curiosity, to a path of self-discovery, which led you back to many silences of your childhood in which you had left parts of yourself behind. And the thing is, what is interesting in a memoir, and what I'm interested in talking about today, and what we're interested in talking about today with the letter writer, is I guess about what's the integrity of sharing your story and having respect for the other people in your life, because you do talk about your ex-husband and you talk about your children and you talk about your mother, and I think that's really interesting about what is your story to share and having the privacy of others. And that's what we're going to talk about in detail after we share the letter writer. But what I want to ask about before we get to all that interesting stuff is, what does creativity mean to you?
Oh, I love that question. I think creativity to me means like the truest expression of our individual essence. I think it's it's an individual essence that we all have, and it's finding the best expression of that. And then I think what happens is that while it's an expression of self and uniqueness, it ends up being, when shared, it ends up being about oneness. Because I think there are pieces that resonate from each of us with individual uniqueness and talents. We can use that individual expression of ourself kind of in that truest sense and find it be really connecting for and with others.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing. I love that.
I feel you on that one, like that, finding that common ground and connecting throughout.
Connecting, yes. And the other thing is that I want to ask everybody is, were you a writer, or were you interested in reading or words as a child, or is this something that just you felt compelled to write because you lost your hearing? Have you always been a writer? Have you always been a creative person? And how did it manifest as in a memoir?
So early on, I was about 10 years old when I was in 5th grade at school and had some issues with girls, kind of some mean girls that had exiled me out of the group. And a school counselor had offered me a journal as a way to start writing about what I felt and to kind of help me make sense of it. She said, you can write poems, however you want. And I wasn't sure if it would really make any difference. But I started that day writing in this composition book. And that's when I became a journal writer, like expressing my truth and my feelings. And I think it was a way that I early on like made sense of my world. And then when I found out that that was kind of the best expression of self for me, I knew I wanted to keep writing. But of course, you know, book writing or article writing or even blog writing is not like journal writing. So I needed to learn how to do it differently. But I think it was that initial knowledge that writing, I could express myself best, I think, with the written word. So I kind of continued that process.
So it's interesting, that connection, like that. So when you did journal write, like when you were journal writing, like even though she'd said, oh, you can write poems or you can do it anyway, did you just fairly much like kind of chronicle what was happening for you every day? Like, was it that style of journal writing?
I did. It actually started when I was trying to make sense of how I was feeling and what I was feeling, especially I think in kind of there was a lot of silence in my household because my mom was a severely depressed individual.
Yeah.
And nobody was talking about it in the house. Yeah. So that journal became the place where I could freely question, ask myself, you know, what was going on. I could share how I was feeling without, like, I felt like it was a best friend in a way, that journal. Yeah. And so there was truth there, but I really quickly became not really as much about where have I gone and what have I done today and what was the weather like, as much as what was I holding inside.
Yeah. And what's the link like between, like, how different is writing a memoir to writing a journal? I mean, obviously a memoir is chronicling what happened in your life and reflecting on it and going in those things. Like, how different are those two processes? Because I'm sure there's people there thinking, I have got some really good journals at home, maybe I could turn them into a memoir, or my story is interesting. Like, what's the
I think it's very different because you know, journal writing is it was just like I wrote for me, for my eyes only. It was never meant to be shared. So it was more really about me without it needing to be about anybody else.
Yeah.
But so it is very different, you know, writing for an audience rather than writing for oneself. But that being said, one of the great things that I found about being a journal writer, even as I got older, was that I could go back to my journals and kind of cross-reference and check some of the information I was writing about, you know, and that was great. It became kind of a reference for me.
It's a great habit to have, isn't it? To have that record.
Right.
Let's come to the creativity challenge that we received from one of the women from the Mama Creative community. I'll get Christina to read it out.
Sure.
And then I want to ask you what your first thoughts are on this challenge, on this question.
Okay. Hi everyone. As a writer, I've been wrestling for quite some time with how to draw the line between my need to express and share aspects of my story and my need to protect my children's privacy, because my story is also their story. I may be comfortable and confident to share various things, but they're not old enough to consent or not to the wider world knowing what their mother did is. It's not so much writing about them specifically as writing about myself and my own family of origin. Even if nothing is said about them as their mother, their story is so bound up in mine. What I'm really getting at is not so much that there are things I need to hide from them, but more pondering the question, what right do I have to tell the wider world that their mother has had X experiences and Y traumas? As a teenager, would you have wanted everyone around you to know private things about your mum? I don't know if I feel I have the right to compromise their privacy in that way. I'm working on a book, but that is still out there, albeit in a different way to social media. Interested to hear your take on this, and especially how you've negotiated this balance.
Wow, I think it's such a critical, great question. It really is. And I think the evolution of telling the story changes through the process. So at first it was, there was a need for me to get my story kind of out initially. Like, what is it that I want to say? What is it about? What's involved? But with the characters and having kind of some delicacy there, I think there's a balance between, as a memoir writer, sharing what the experience was like for me and owning my part in it, rather than making it about what they did or how they showed up to make me kind of the victim. That instead of it being, gosh, they did these things and it was really rough, it's more about really honing in on what did I learn about myself through that. And as a character in a memoir, me being a main character, how did they shape and influence me without it being, giving too much information necessarily about them. So as an example, and we talked about it just a minute ago, that the two main characters in my memoir are my mother, who was severely depressed for my whole childhood and still really, really struggles with severe depression. And knowing that I wanted to honor her, of course, in this, but at the same time, the fact that I grew up with a severely depressed mother had an impact on my personality and the way I viewed things. So by taking some time in developing the story, what I really got specific about was the meaning I made about myself because of what I experienced with my mom. So as an example, one of the things that I wondered was, because she was so severely depressed, if I was a better daughter, would she have been healthier? Would she have been happier? So there were times, especially in childhood, that I took that on and I thought, maybe I'm not good enough. Maybe if I was a better daughter, she would want to live. She would be happier. She would get up out of her bedroom more and interact. So it was really, that was the assumption that I made about myself, right? What was interesting was, after writing it and knowing that I needed to have a conversation with my mom about the book being published, I could share that with her. I could say to her, I'm bringing this up because we didn't talk about it as a family, and it's an issue for many people out in the world. And it's specifically too, if we're talking about people like Anthony Bourdain or Kate Spade, right? That take their lives, even though they live great, they leave behind 11 and 12-year-old daughters. Somebody needs to start having, there are families that need to have those conversations. So that was my gift in sharing it, was not to make my mom the the bad person or me, the victim for experiencing it. It was to have the conversation that needs to be shared, that needs to be had.
I get that. Yeah, go on.
So I was going to say, when I told my mom that, when I said,
how did that conversation go?
Right, I bring these things up not because I'm shaming you, but because the conversation can help people. She was also able to say to me, and I stayed behind closed doors and I wasn't interactive because I knew I wasn't a great person to be around. So I was trying to protect you. Right? So she has her reasons for doing things. She thought by not being around as much, she was protecting me. I thought, gosh, I need my mom, and maybe she doesn't want to be around me, and I'm not a good enough daughter, and blah, blah, blah.
Does that change your relationship for the better in some way?
Definitely.
You find the conversation, and it actually wasn't so bad. It was actually good.
Right. But I think the other important thing when writing about it was it was really important to show and not tell. It's a lot different to say I grew up with a severely depressed mother who was never around. Instead, I had to describe that. I had to take those scenes and have her behind those closed doors. So I showed it. I didn't tell it. I showed it.
That's a great memoir writing technique that I've heard about. It's like show, not tell. Can you talk a bit more about that as a technical construct that really works in memoir writing? About how that works.
Sure. I think it also works well with the other question about that privacy question too, and hurting someone, because so as an example, I feel like show, not tell is really about almost getting the mindset while writing as a director of a movie scene. And it's bigger, kind of setting the stage, right? But then we pan in and we go right into the actual scene that is so critical. And so, like for me, it was, as an example with my mom, was me standing outside these double white doors that were closed. And I knew there was darkness and blackness beneath, but I didn't know what was behind those doors. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to go in, but my dad had said, don't bother your mother. So that's one of the scenes that I wrote, was a contemplation about sitting outside and being honest about one part of me that wants to break through those doors, and the other part doesn't know what's there, whether I even should or not. But then this one day I decide to go in. So I write about the scene of opening the door and seeing blackness, and wondering why there's no light in the room, and seeing a silhouette underneath covers that looks almost like a corpse. So in a lot of ways, that it's that scene writing of what I'm seeing and what I'm describing rather than telling. So, and at the same time, it's really not blaming mom as much as it is, this was the scene. And if you show rather than tell, the reader can put those dots together and say, wow, something's going on behind those closed doors. We don't really know what that is yet, but we'll probably find out.
It's not making it obvious and giving it away. It's not giving away the punchline. It's setting the scene and building it with rich descriptions and language and evocative scene setting. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yes, and I think another quick little illustration is one of the, with privacy too, is one of the last scenes that I wrote about was at 19, I had to take my mom to the psychiatric ward because she had threatened to take her life. Yeah. And that's a tough scene to write about, taking her to a psych ward, but I really wrote it from my perspective, and there was a whole lot that I didn't need to say about her experience there. So that's the other thing. There's the craft really of setting up the stage and saying enough, but I didn't need to go overboard and where I would have kind of really invaded her privacy with that.
Did you, when you had this conversation, like something that I'm curious about, like, and I don't even know, I'm curious about this, like on a legal level as well as a kind of ethical or emotional level. Do you, when you're writing about other people, do you need to ask their permission? Like, would you have been allowed, like, if you'd published that and your mum had read that, even after the conversation just said, I don't want this story out there, everyone knows it's about me, it's slanderous, or it puts me in a wrong light. Is there a legal problem with that? Like, do you need to legally get permission if you're writing about people in a memoir, like in terms just like on a practical level, but also...
Is there a type of obligation in
Yeah, and are you ethically obliged to tell people, and like, what if you can't tell the person? I don't know. So what is there like a, so there's a legal, I kind of got a legal ethical question around that kind of conversation you had with your mum.
Right. I think I didn't have to get legal permission, but it was actually, so my publisher happened to be Joanne Fedler Media, right? But Joanne said to me after reading the final manuscript, right, and I had done revisions, but had said to me, you need to talk to 2 people before this gets published, and that's your mom and your ex-husband, because there can be, you know, if there's slander there, or you know, it gets a little tricky. So I knew that conversation with my mom was going to be difficult, but I also knew I had to write it. So that's one thing that's common. Like there are a lot of other writers too that I had spoken with that kind of said, I'm wondering whether I should wait till my mother passes and then write this story, you know, which I can totally understand. But I was fortunate. I think I was nervous with the conversation, but I was fortunate enough to be able to, I think, do it with compassion and love, and even write it with some compassion and love, that she was able to say, if this helps people, then that's great. I'm not super proud of it. I'm not super excited that everybody's going to know this about me, but if it helps people, I'm willing to do that. So I'm not sure as much legally, as much as it's really important just for relationships, I think, to let those people know that you've written about them.
You legally need her to sign a waiver or an agreement or something to say she wouldn't change her mind or sue you or force you to, you know, withdraw the book from the market or anything. Do you need to do that?
We didn't need to do that. I know, you know, with my ex-husband, it was a little, he had said to me, well, I don't mind as long as it's true. And I said, well, it is, but it's also my truth. It's my experience too, right? So that's where it's a little sticky with memoir. But again, I had described scenes and showed scenes, and he obviously doesn't win Husband of the Year with this book, you know, with how he's portrayed. But it wasn't anything that I think would have ever hurt him professionally or personally, you know, in the global sense.
What if either of them had said that they were really unhappy with it and really didn't want you to publish it? Would you have published it anyway?
I thought about that because I was worried about my mom and the relationship too. But I got to a point where I said, I know I need to write this. And I think part of that was because there was so much silence about it and around it, you know, and the whole story was about that. The whole story was about, you know, really unspoken truths and silences that had not been discussed or brought up. And I got to a point where I said, no, I have to say this. I have to tell this story.
And would you have been willing to live with the fallout? Do you think if you're going to start writing a memoir and like the person you're writing about isn't dead, do you need to like steel yourself for a willingness either way, how those conversations go?
I think
how did you get into that?
I think it comes later. Like I think that's probably one of the reasons why it took me a really long time to write, was I wanted to do it well and be honoring at the same time as truthful. But I would suggest that people, if they really feel like they want to write it, and then you have to face those kind of questions at the end when you're really talking about getting it published.
I think that's, thank you for sharing that. I think there's 2 things that come to mind for me. One is getting back to the letter writer's specific question, because they talk about their children. And I understand your mother and your ex-husband are adults and they can make their own decisions and they lived through it and they were responsible or not responsible within their role. And that's a different conversation than children who don't have any voice or authority because they're being written about, or their concern is that they're too young to have any influence over how it goes and how that will impact their children once that story is out there. So there's that, I guess that screen or something around that, the children and how it's going to. She's got 2 children. How that's going to impact the children if you're writing about the children or if you're writing about. And the other thing is, if the story is about and it's integral to the story, is violence or murder or other types of big taboo or difficult topics, how do you give integrity to the story? Which I know there's, mental health and there are aspects to your story as well that relate to that a little bit. But I'm wondering, again, how do you maintain integrity? I understand show and tell, not tell. I understand writing it from your perspective, but how do you navigate those 2 areas? So protecting the children and still creating the scene where violence might be involved, domestic violence, etc.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it comes really down to what you choose to what makes it in that final draft and what doesn't. So as an example, my kids were really young during my story, during the time that I experienced not being able to hear. And of course they were affected because they had a mother who was adapting to being hearing impaired and had hearing aids in and all of that kind of stuff. And they were affected by divorce. So I had to make a decision about that because I knew that, here they are, they have me and they have their dad. And that's one of the reasons why I don't go into great detail about the actual details of the divorce. So I lead it up to that. I lead up to where I made that decision to leave, but I don't talk about the nitty gritty of how horrible it was to have this conversation with these 2 young boys, right? And to have to tell them that was just something that I decided I was not going to do at the time because I kind of wanted to honor their privacy as an example. Yeah. So I think there's some decision making about how far you go into depth with whatever person it might be really challenging for. And like you were saying, I didn't want to make an assumption about what that was like for the boys. I knew it was like what it was like for me. But there was so much more into the story that I didn't have to go into the nitty gritty of a difficult divorce.
So what I'm hearing is there's a great story without having to go into those sensitive areas. You can create a story and still create a great read for the person reading it you've got to make choices. And you have to be sensitive to privacy, but you can still create the scene and just find a different lens in which to share that story.
Right. I think it comes down to what's really important for the story and what is kind of a peripheral, not so important.
What about something that comes up for me? I work across, when I'm doing business coaching, I work across creative platforms. And actually this concept of like when your work talks, and it certainly happens in my own work, and I've had this thought about there's certain stories I feel like, I'm only going to really be able to fully admit what's behind that song when the people they're about are like dead or gone or can't access ever hearing them. That these stories, and I work a lot with a lot of visual artists, and like that a lot of them have got stories in there. And when we're marketing creative work, so much of it is about creating a connection between the people who follow your work and the artists themselves and the story behind the work, because we're trying to create emotional connection. And sometimes for some of the clients I work with, I know that a lot of their work and their story and where they've got to has been fueled by sadly, in this culture of, I work a lot with women, and in this culture of toxic masculinity, and here in Australia we have just an awful problem with domestic violence and violence against women, and women being killed by their husbands. So like you're saying about this, like these are stories that are so important to tell, and like while the stats are out there and we've got factual information going out there, the artists got this opportunity to connect. Like you described this story about your mum in the dark room. Straight away I can feel that story. I know that story because you've painted it emotionally. So an artist is painting these stories emotionally. So we can talk about, we know in Australia that this is a problem statistically, but emotionally the artist has this way of connecting their story emotionally. So it's important, but it's also dangerous. When we're talking about an ex-husband who's violent or has mental health, or there's domestic abuse, or there are children still involved who could be impacted. So how do you even though this is not about specifically memoir writing, it's still this same thing about how do we shed light on these really important topics that are dangerous, that do tread on toes? Like how do we as artists fulfill our role to tell these stories, but to do it safely? How do we safely do this? Because sometimes I feel this tension between, I know on a practical, pragmatic level, this story needs to go out there and I want to support the artist to tell a story, and I know it'll help people connect with what they're doing deeper and help them sell more work. I don't want to help them sell more work and then, thanks for that, I sold a painting and now my ex-husband's come and shot me in the head. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's so tough. Like you said, that's so difficult. Yeah, I think again, like for that artist, for the person that needs to express it, I think it's about helping us have a conversation by understanding really specifically what thoughts process does this person go through, right? Like one of the things we might think about is, why does someone stay in a relationship time and time again? But I think it's about going super deep into that storyline of what questions are they asking themselves, and bring, what are the thoughts that go through their head, and what are the stops and the starts, and their fears and their wishes, and what, I think it's getting really deep into those things, that the
impact on them.
Do you think you need to be explicit then? Like, because you've been talking in a way, a lot of this way of getting around treading on toes is that what's going on is implicit in the way you're telling the story. So you're not straight out saying, and when I grew up, I had mum that was depressed, or this artist might not say, and I became a strong, amazing woman, or, this artwork's dark and grey because of this relationship, or whatever it is. So do you think it's about, so how do you connect authentically the story behind it if we're sort of dodging around it and just keeping the story implicit? And do we have an obligation to be explicit? Where does that all?
I think that those are all such great questions, but I also think it could even be like a background part too, like, why does this specific person fall into this? What made that up? How did, what kind of led someone to this? And how, what are they wrestling with and asking themselves, and kind of really like the process, so that it's not just about, look what it did to me again, and look what happened here, and like the kind of the conversation, and the reason that it needs to get out is to help others, right? Go, what do you do in this case? Or if you have a great friend, what do you do? Or what do you tell someone, or how do you help someone in a situation and yet keep them still safe? Or what is safety? And so I think it's a tough one, but I think it's the conversation has to be had, because if we just pretend and just kind of skirt over it and act like it's not out there, then it's just not giving any validity to that person that's suffering every day.
It sounds like you're suggesting, and I've also worked in domestic violence as an art therapist.
I was interested in that perspective.
With children, if we just take this topic, for example. But I think it's about, you can't undo what happened to the children and the families. But what I try to do when I work with them is to work with the presenting issues, which is anxiety, and help them with emotional regulation. So then they can live the rest of their lives with these great interventions, that they can manage anxiety and they can connect with the anxiety and manage it before it manifests into some type of escalation. And I think what I'm hearing from you, and when we talk about this as if someone wants to take the role of helping others and sharing their story as an example, that takes a lot of confidence. And so they need to take it from, I think, a position of empowerment and focus on the themes and not be a victim. When you start blaming someone, even if they have attacked you and been violent, then what you have to do is take that presenting information and what are you going to do with that? And I've, with Mama Creatives, we've done these story slam events where we have 6 women from the community sharing stories about a particular theme. Now, the first time we did that, one of the women shared her story about being sexually abused. She was raped. She didn't actually talk about the person as such. She talked about herself and her role post-abuse, post-experience, and where she was, how she felt. You could get a sense of everything, how it was and how vulnerable she felt, that she worked herself through that story until she's in this empowered position where she now wants to help others who have been in that similar role. And so he almost becomes it happened because of a man attacking her, but she didn't give him the power by talking about him. She took her power back by focusing the story on her and the emotions and how she felt and how she got through it over time and all the different things. So if you are a victim, you can relate to her experience and then somehow understand that you can get through it with these types of, it wasn't about telling people how to get through it, but by sharing her story, that in itself was powerful. She'd been holding on to it for 11 years. And so we gave her that sort of storytelling platform to talk about what had happened to her. She'd been wanting to do it, and now she wants to help others. And I think it's about, even though if you are a victim, it's about overcoming that victim position and finding your power. I think if you want to write a memoir, we spoke to Joanne about this, we need to take back why, we need to ask ourselves, why are we doing it? Who's our audience? And what do we want to get from it? And if you take it from that platform, then you're then becoming a writer owning the story. I think you spoke about that from the beginning, that you weren't a victim in this. You're just showing, not telling. And I think all of that is that sort of more or less about what you were saying?
You're spot on, Anna, and I think that's one of the other important aspects is that it takes some time to not be too close to the content of the story, and you have to take that time where there's some distance because the narrator is different from the character. And it took me a while to realize that the narrator tells that story, right? In Memoir, the narrator is the same physical person.
Right.
But I had to get where I could view the character of Michele differently than I would feeling the character of Michele. So I think you're right, Anna, like that person who is helping after such a horrible personal experience, but is sharing it to empower others and show that resilience, has some distance from the pain enough that it's a gift to share it now.
Yeah, she was ready for it. And I think if we're going to touch on some really raw and difficult topics, that's what I wanted to ask you next. Is I know it took you 5 years to write this story, that it was a lifetime of creating the story. And I wanted to talk to you about that process of where you vomit up your emotions and how you, and that process of it becoming an actual story for readers to read, where you become a writer for an audience rather than your personal journal sharing everything that happened to you. Because I think that's the difference, is that it has to be readable. It can't just be your therapy journal, because unless it's something like Go Ask Alice or some brilliant diary format, but that also is a particular style of writing. I think there has to be this sort of process where you let go, which is what you said, of the of you, and then you become this sort of narrator of this story. Well, can you take us through how that happened, how you were able to interchange and then become a writer for a reader rather than your journal? How did you evolve from that?
Yes, great question. And it takes a lot of time too, or it did for me. But I think you're right. Like initially, I knew I just had to get a bunch out. The other thing that's important is while writing a story like that too, like even my personal story, it's not a linear process. It's not like starting on day one and going through how it's going to go. There were bits that came to me. And so I wrote this piece, and then I wrote that piece, and then it would come to me to write about this part. And then I gathered all of these. I just said, okay, to whatever I felt like I needed to creatively write. And then I gathered all of those things. And what happens along the process was I got more and more specific of coming back to the question, what am I really trying to say? Because it was so, at first it was like, well, I'm trying to say I couldn't hear and how hard that was. And I'm trying to make sense of that. But the other thing is I'm talking about a marriage that didn't work out. And I'm talking about this mother who was severely depressed, that it was really, how are all of these pieces coming together, and what is this story really about? Because it's about so much more than we think initially. When we really think about the themes of the story and what is it that this story is really about, that helps change and shift the writing as we go. Because I think what I initially thought it was about changed, and the shift becomes, how can I help others how are others going to benefit from hearing my story? And for me, my thought was, it's not just for people maybe that lost their hearing. It's about struggle. It's about any struggle. Mine happened to be health-wise, right? And how I struggled through some times to kind of, and a lot of it, of course, being that I believe there's an emotional component to any of our illnesses. So for me, it was about figuring that out, but it was also about realizing from what happened to me that maybe that I could help people by saying, hey, it took me a really long time to heal because I was looking externally for all the answers, when my belief is that the answers really came way better from in here. And I was looking outside for all of those answers. So I'm really offering an invitation to anyone struggling to look a little bit more inwardly than outwardly. But I didn't know that was such a critical question in the very beginning when I started writing it. Do you see? It was more like I lost my hearing, and maybe my upbringing had something to do with this, and blah, 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 blah. But then it really becomes about, in any time of struggle, and in our sense of self, what do we do? What do we do in any kinds of turbulent struggles and times to help ourselves heal? And how, when we lose ourselves, do we find our way back?
It was amazing. It was amazing with you because it's such a real theme. You lost your hearing and you were living in silence, and then your struggle to understand that became so loud. Although you were living in silence, this theme it's a beautiful book, and it's incredible. And I think a lot of people can understand that universal theme of trying to reclaim to be heard, to find our voice. And you found your voice by losing your hearing, and then your hearing came back. It's an amazing book. And then when you go back and revisit the silence of growing up with your mother, the silence of growing up with your mother. And it all comes together, and then being silenced in your marriage in some ways.
Tip to tea on the couch.
And so it's an amazing book. I love it, and I think the themes are great. And I think it's what you were saying is that it's not about you anymore, and that's where you start. It's about you because you feel compelled to share it, and then it becomes about others. And I think that's true of a lot of art forms when you want it to go out into the world. Otherwise, you just keep it for you. I just draw for myself. I don't feel I need to display that in any exhibition or have a gallery or have that type of thing. But if you want it to go into the world, It does have to be about others, and you have to be ready to receive. But if we go back to that question, have we answered? Do you think we've answered that person's question?
I think we've answered it in the sense that it's tricky. I don't think it does sound like when you're writing about other people and involving other people, it does sound like there's an element of there is no easy answer to this. There is no like tick a box. It's got to be what you're comfortable with and what you're able to follow through. Like it sounds like you have to be a little bit brave and willing to tell the story anyway.
But also maybe start with what happened to you, but then own it. Don't be a victim. And then not make it about them.
Yes, so you got to make it about yourself, not about them, and then
make it about the reader. So it's kind of like a bit of a process where you start with you, but to protect other people's privacy, it's not about them. They're sort of peripheral within it, and it's about you and your journey and your search. If you want to be a memoir, otherwise you can write a novel or something. But if you want to make it a memoir, if you want to protect your children and other people who are important and integral to the story, there are ways of creating a rich narrative through these descriptive vehicles or mechanisms that you've shared with us. I think it's a very interesting area, though. It's a very grey area, but I think you've given us a lot of clarity on how to approach it.
I hope so. Yeah. I hope so. You guys asked some great questions. Really, I think one of the other things, just and a balance too, is like with a difficult character that needs to be in the book. That character has positive and negative traits. So I think that's the other thing. Like, you know, as tough as it was to have this severely depressed mother, she had some really great points about her too. My ex-husband, even though there were tough times and the marriage didn't work out, there were some quality points about him too. So that's another layer to add in. You know, it's not all about how horrible this person was, you know, too. Like there's some balance there and some choice there, I think.
Like some compassion or diplomacy.
I also think it's all part of the growth. Like the worst things that happen to you, the more adversity that happens to you is a gift in some ways. I mean, depending on what it is, because it forces you to learn and grow, and you have two choices. That's life. It's tough. You either go down a victim and a horrible sort of approach, or you have to somehow find the courage and strength inside to move forward. Even if terrible things have happened to you, you can't undo them. So you do need to make a choice. And that's, I think, when people overcome that, that's what gives them the strength. And I haven't been through terrible trauma such as the Holocaust, for example, but I have worked with Holocaust people in my work when I was as a therapist and in other ways. And I remember speaking to these amazing survivors of the Holocaust. And there was this one woman who I will never forget. She was in 90. She looked about 60. She didn't need a cane. She was so lucid, looked beautiful, no wrinkles. And I said, how do you have so much joy and energy and curiosity to get engaged in the world and so much compassion? And she said, I made a choice. I made a choice to forgive. She said, because forgiveness is giving your power back to you. Forgiveness isn't letting them off the hook. Forgiveness is giving you power. And she said she made a choice to be alive and awake in the world and not let them win. So she chose to find a good life and to have compassion. And not everybody can do that, granted. But to hear that from her, it was life-changing. And I'm like, you are amazing. She also said, how you are in your old age is an example or a result of how you've lived your life. So she's in such good health in her 90s because she chose to rise above what has happened to her. Now, she was an exceptional person, and I've never forgotten that. And I think that's all we have. We can't undo those terrible things that have happened, but it's a great way of looking at trauma. And then I've also worked with other women and men from the Holocaust, and they couldn't get past that. And I have a lot of respect. And I don't know how I would have survived it, but you know, one of the women, she had nightmares every night, and she couldn't get past that. So it depends on, and there's no answer. I mean, I probably would be in the same boat, but it was interesting to hear the different perspectives of trauma, and so much respect for that type of level of trauma. But this particular woman was able to overcome it and choose this life. And I'm not saying that everybody can do that, but it's an interesting sort of observation, I guess, of people who have been through a lot, and of yourself as well. It wasn't an easy marriage. It wasn't an easy childhood. Trauma is trauma, and it affects us in different ways. And you've taken that and written this beautiful book. And I want to thank you for your time. But before we leave today, we're asking all our guests, what is your favourite C word? Because there's so many good C words out there.
Oh my gosh, my favorite C word. I think it's connection.
Love that.
Because I really, like through conversations like this and through truth and having, real conversations and important conversations, that connection to me is like so soul feeding. And I think that's my favorite C word.
My favorite C word today.
Do you know, after this conversation, I'm feeling my favorite C word today is compassion, because I'm realizing actually the way you're talking about this whole process of writing memoirs or talking about your own story, in a way you have to find some compassion for, the nemesis and the baddies in your story, even though they're in your life, and compassion for yourself. And so I don't know, I'm feeling some compassion vibes today.
I'm feeling consciousness. I'm feeling that this is like this collective consciousness that we're all in humanity. There is evil and there's light and there's everything in between. And when you have these conversations and you share this story, it's quite a personal story. And thinking of all the people I've worked with who've been through some terrible things, there's this sort of collective consciousness that we come together with connection and compassion, and we have this conversation, and it just feels beautiful, and there's this great clarity that comes from this type of this chat, I guess, this conversation. So consideration and consciousness, I think, to be considered when you listen and when you share. I think we need to be more like that in the world. Humans are always going to be evil. We're always going to inflict pain on others. It's just since the beginning of time there's been wars and tribal, warfare all the way through. We're not going to change. And then it's how you choose again, how you live with that. It's a conscious decision on how to live your life, I think. And I think you've really made me feel conscious about that today in this conversation.
That's great. I love this.
And I think it also felt like the other thing too is just like it does again bring back in that like the role of the artist, like that we have been given these special skills to be able to explain the intangible, emotional, and create empathy and that connection. Like I feel less alone in my own experience of feeling unworthy in a childhood where people were doing their best, but it made me feel less than. And only when you tell that story, it's powerful for me to know I'm not the only one, that there's a good chance I can hear your story and say there's no way it was because you were unworthy that's the experience you had. So if I can say that there's no way, if it was no way the case for you, there's a pretty good chance there's no way it's the case for me. And I just think that's something super beautiful that we can give each other and ourselves and the world through art and creativity. And thanks for being brave. I don't think it's easy to tell these stories and risk treading on toes, and thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. And I appreciate you guys so much, because I think you're right. It's like when we can have great, truthful conversations and share personal story, then we kind of give each other permission to access that within ourselves. And that's really beautiful.
Right. And that's where we can grow and change and give and find our place in the world.
Right.
Amazing. Thank you. You're amazing.
Thank you.
I love it.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much.
Pukka Tea have been generous enough to send us all these teas so we can have tea while we have our talk on the creativity couch. And there's all these wonderful teas. And I'm drinking Revitalize at the moment. There's all these wonderful teas. It's a lovely brand. And we've got Relax. And, so we're just saying cheers from our tea on the couch.
So from our morning tea to your bedtime tea.
Evening tea. Pukka covered.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much. Really enjoyed this.
Speak soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Our next episode is with Bron Mandel, online content expert, blogger and founder of Mum Life. We'll be talking social media and how to show up online in the way that feels right for you. If you have a creativity challenge you'd like us to chat about, then send us a letter to letters@creativitycouch.com and feel free to send us your favourite C word. You could win some Pukka Tea.